Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, we are engaging with a subject that I think is of utmost importance, but it's a subject that I confess we don't hear much taught on or talked about, or at least I don't. And to help us talk about the subject we're going to be looking at today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Adrian Birks. Adrian is the leader of the community church in Honiton. He's been there for 10 years, which is part of New Frontiers, part of the Commission Apostolic Sphere. He also serves a number of churches on behalf of Commission in the southwest of England. He is married to Jenny, has 3 adult kids and 5 grandkids, as I heard earlier. One of the things I was most interested in and excited about Adrian and wanting to meet him and talk to him was because at a recent gathering of pastors, he shared that one of his hobbies, he likes to relax by studying ancient manuscripts. And I thought, I want to meet that man and find out more about him. Adrian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Now, I'm aware in my introduction just then, I didn't actually tell anybody what the said subject is that we're going to be diving into together. Why don't you kind of just set up for us the sort of thing that we're going to be talking about and why you think it's an important conversation for us to be having?
So we're going to be talking about the relationship, particularly between Israel and the church. I think it's really important. Obviously, lots of contemporary events have perhaps raised the subject again for us. But I still think for a lot of Christians, there are lots of questions. Has the church replaced Israel? Does Israel have a divine right to the land in the Middle East? And lots of those kinds of questions. And I would say also for us as leaders, some of us will have had experience of people coming to our church who are very militant on this subject. And I think it's really good to be prepared. I think that's probably partly how I kind of started looking into the subject. So I think it's as you say, on the one hand, it's an important subject, and yet at the same time, it seems that many of our churches, we don't seem to teach on it that much, and many of our people haven't given much thought to it, even our leaders. It affects obviously, your view on Israel affects lots of other things as well. It affects how you view the church. It affects your view of end times. It affects perhaps your attitude to global mission. And so I think it's a really important subject, but probably one that can be easily neglected, and perhaps neglected because of a lot of accusations, at least, thrown out in the public about anti-Semitism. I think, we don't want to be accused of that, so it's easy to avoid it.
Yeah, and obviously with Israel is often in the news. There's often unrest in the Middle East. It has been for the last 2 years, just before this conversation, although it seems to have died down a bit recently. And I think for me, it was interesting kind of to put this back on the radar of things that we need to think about and talk about. Was a few months ago, we had a welcome lunch, people from the church, some people who were brand new to Christianity, some people who'd been Christians for a long time. And after the lunch, I kind of did a spiel about the church and said, any questions? And a lady put her hand up and said, I've got a question. And for me, this is a deal-breaking question. It's a question of the utmost importance to me. I feel very strongly about this. And so I kind of braced myself, think, what's it going to be? There's a number of hot topic issues. But what she said, I wasn't really expecting. She said, do you hold to replacement theology? And I thought, okay, I wasn't expecting that. And so I kind of explained, no, I don't. And actually, I talked about what I do believe. And it was interesting afterwards because then I had the new Christian in the room, and I said, I don't know, it's hard trying to explain the issue in a way that someone like her, who understands and uses terms like replacement theology, and a brand new Christian, his response to me when I asked him about what he made of it, he said, what is it, just like Christian beef between people? And I was like, well, Christian beef is one way of thinking about it. Like disagreements in the church, I don't know. So I thought it'd be great to have this conversation to help me, if nothing else, think through. And you've written a brilliant paper, Israel and the Church. You wrote it a number of years ago, I think, and you've made it available for people in your church. So let's first of all talk about why this is a hard subject to talk about. Particularly in light of some recent, very significant historic events that have probably rightly changed the temperature of the conversation around issues to do with Israel and the church.
Yeah. Can I say before that, I think Christian beef would be the great title for a podcast. Um, anyway, yeah. So I think there are two events in the 20th century that have shaped the conversation about Israel hugely. And the first one is the Holocaust. And obviously, just a couple of days ago, we had Holocaust Memorial Day, the terrible killing of 6 million Jews in the Second World War. And that has absolutely changed the conversation. Firstly, it's affected Israel as a nation, um, because Israel is absolutely determined to never be victims again. And so when we look at something like what's happened in the last few years in the Middle East, and we look and think, wow, what an overreaction and what's going on. And I'm not here to make political statements at all, but I think when people say those kind of things, it's like you haven't appreciated their history. They are determined to never be victims again like that. And of course, what happened on October the 7th was the biggest killing of Jews and so on since the Holocaust. So, and the agenda of a number of very public agenda of some of the Middle Eastern nations is to push Israel into the sea. So the Holocaust has affected Israel hugely, but it's also affected how Christians relate to Israel and talk about Israel. Because while obviously the Holocaust was caused by Nazi Germany and they were responsible for it, it probably wouldn't have happened without the 2,000 years of church history, which was pretty anti-Semitic. And we haven't got time to go through lots of them. But if you were to look at some of the things that church leaders have said down through the centuries, you would probably be shocked. And some of them are church leaders that you think, oh, they're reputable. We would quote them. We would, quote them in our sermons. And then you read some of the things they say about the Jews. For example, John Chrysostom, one of the early church fathers, 4th century, he said for the killing of Jesus, it is incumbent upon all Christians to hate the Jews. And so you read statements like that, you think, wow, a Christian leader. I could quote lots of others, but jumping forward in history, Adolf Hitler quoted Martin Luther a number of times. And Martin Luther said, this is not a verbatim quote, but he said we should burn down their synagogues, we should burn down their houses, and we should find a way to basically be free of something like this devilish burden, the Jews. So a lot of history and replacement theology has kind of been woven into that, has been anti-Semitic. And so when you talk about Israel now, I think that affects, on the one hand, we think, oh, I don't want to say anything that criticizes Israel because I might be considered anti-Semitic. And people have even gone so far as to suggest that actually, if you're a faithful Jew, then that's fine. You carry on being a faithful Jew, and that's another way of salvation. And obviously, yes, some believe in Jesus, but if you're a faithful Jew, that's fine. And you just think that is a huge compromise of the gospel. So I think the Holocaust has casts a long shadow. That's the first thing.
That's great. Can I ask on that? 'Cause I think I will come on to the second thing that's really shaped this conversation. But why did church leaders often speak about Israel and the Jews in the way that they did? I think I can understand on one level, reading the New Testament, the book of Acts, a lot of the early opposition to the church were the Judaizers, shall we say, and devout Jewish people like the Apostle Paul before his conversion. And so I can understand in one sense there was you read about it in the book of Revelation as well, like the early church is trying to hold on against the opposition from Jews. Is that part of it, or is there something broader going on there?
I mean, the short answer, of course, would be sin. So all racism has its roots in sin. I think the early church blamed the Jewish leaders and the Jewish people for the killing of Jesus. And of course, there's an element of truth in that, that yes, the Jewish leaders were leading the charge against Jesus. Of course, it's quite kind of proud to say, of course, we wouldn't have done that. That's the Jews did that. Whereas actually, if we were in their place, we would probably have done the same thing. But anyway, that's, I think, so in the very early years, there was a lot of they were responsible for killing the Jews. But then over the centuries, I think the church wanted to very much differentiate itself from Judaism, and say, no, we're Christians. And so the early church fathers wrote multiple times about how the whole Bible is a Christian book. The Old Testament is a Christian book. So alongside the defeat of Israel and the destroying of the temple and the crushing of Israel by the Romans, the Jews increasingly became marginalized and despised, alongside the church saying, we're nothing to do with the Jews. They killed Jesus. So I think it grew and grew. And so in a way then, they were displaced people and they became a very easy target. And as I say, then that has continued for 2,000 years. You read up on it and it's pretty terrible. Some of the things that happened to Israel and to Jews about being banished from lands and not being allowed houses, not being allowed to work, just so badly treated. So I think, as with many things, they evolve and grow and become something that is unimaginable by the end. And I think so. Yeah, the church, as I say, the church was not responsible for the Holocaust in one sense, but it'd be hard to argue they didn't make any contribution, because some of the things that were said were terrible. And that's why things like evangelizing Jews, the Jews don't see the cross as a symbol of redemption. They see the cross as a symbol of oppression. And so I think that's part of why the church then easily swings the other way. No, we're for Israel. We're for you. And of course, there's a rightness in that, addressing some of the terrible things that happen. But you can't do that in a non-Christian way. You can't abandon the gospel in doing that. I think that's the challenge.
Yes, no, very helpful. And actually then to come on to the second major contribution in the last 100 years, you, in one sense, laid the groundwork for it when you said that, the Romans destroyed the nation of Israel, or, made them a displaced people, which they remained throughout the past, 2,000 years of history until very recently. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yes, so throughout the 19th century, there was an increasing Zionist movement pursuing a homeland for the Jewish people. And early in the 20th century, the British government signed what was called the Balfour Agreement, which affirmed this desire for a homeland for the Jewish people. And early in the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, which had governed the region of what at that point was called Palestine and Transjordan, the Ottoman Empire had ruled it. That empire had collapsed. And the British government were then given responsibility for establishing a homeland for the Jewish people. They're given that responsibility by the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. Then for the next 30 years, there was just constant conflict between Jews and Arabs. So many Jews had moved to the land of Israel. They'd bought houses, they'd bought land, but the constant conflict. And the British, after the Second World War, then just said, we can't do this. This isn't going to work. They handed it back to what at that time was then the United Nations. And the United Nations put together what was called a partition plan, which was different regions within the area of what is now Israel, governed some by Jews, some governed by Arabs, but under one economic kind of unity. So a kind of two-state solution. That was agreed in 1947 and then put into place in 1948. And then following that, hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world then returned to the area. But obviously, as we know, lots and lots of conflict that carries on up to this day over those decades. Jeremy Bowen, who's a BBC editor, he was the Middle East editor, he might be foreign editor or something now, I don't know. But he's written some very, very good books, kind of taking you through the history of the last 70 years or so. And then, of course, in 1967, there was the Six-Day War and the occupation of Jerusalem. So going back to the question of Israel and the church and those kind of things, the establishing of a homeland for the Jewish people and the occupation of Jerusalem, many would see that as that's the fulfillment of Old Testament promises and prophecies. And basically, I mean, some would even say that gets rid of basically all other theologies. Zionism must be true because Israel's back in the land. So as I say, those two events, the Holocaust and the establishing of the state of Israel, they affect every conversation now, I think, about Israel. And
that's very helpful. Can you remind people who won't be familiar what the Six-Day War in 1967 was about?
So very briefly, Egypt had, I think, attacked or prepared to attack Israel. Israel responded very, very quickly and overcame Egypt, and in that time then moved into some other areas like occupying Jerusalem. Even now it's still mixed, but lots of those areas like the Golan Heights and things are governed by Israel. And so there's Palestinian areas, but then there's obviously Gaza now. Most of them have been pushed into that area. So, so the conflict goes back to at least to the establishing of the State of Israel in 1948, which many would see, as I say, as the fulfillment of prophecy and promise.
Yes. And actually, so it's very helpful. I really appreciate this. Used in your summary there, that because of or in light of the events of 1948 and 1967, therefore Zionism must be true and all other positions or theologies are redundant in the face of that. And introducing that term Zionism, you kind of introduce us to what I'd love us to look at now. So I think that there are, as you put in your booklet, broadly speaking, three main perspectives on the relationship between Israel and the church, as you call them: dispensational Zionism, classical Zionism, and fulfillment theology. So having set us up with some of the challenges around this conversation historically and, contemporary, modernly anyway, could you give us an introduction to those three? Dispensational Zionism, what is it?
Dispensationalism as a system was devised by a guy called Jane Darby, who's a British guy, but it was made popular by the Scofield Reference Bible. Cyrus Scofield was American, and at the beginning of the 20th century, he produced his Scofield Reference Bible. And basically, dispensationalism divides world history up into 7 dispensations or ages. A dispensation is a period of time. And so what Darby and Scofield said is that world history is divided up into 7 different ages. And in each period, God works with people in different ways. And he said, well, let's try this. We'll work in this way. Oh, that didn't work. So he then tries another way. And each way then he moves from one to the other because the previous way failed. And that's a really important thing. So world history is divided up into a number of different dispensations. And in simple terms, they would be Adam, Noah, Babel, Abraham, and Moses. And then the 6th and 7th are probably the most important for this topic. The 6th age is where we are now, the church age, the 6th dispensation, and begins with the first coming of Christ, and it will end with the second coming of Christ. And dispensationalists would see this as a primarily Gentile age, focusing on the church. This age then will come to an end because, like all other ages, the church will fail. It will not work out well. And then Jesus will return. Dispensationalism is premillennial, which means Jesus will come back before the millennium, before his 1,000-year reign. And that's the 7th age, which is called the Age of the Kingdom. And that is a golden age where Jesus will reign from Jerusalem with ethnic Jews And that's the golden age, and that's really the fulfillment of all the Old Testament promises and prophecies. Dispensationalists draw very clear lines then between Israel and the church. They're separate things. One is the earthly people of God, and one is the heavenly people of God. Israel is the physical, and the church is the spiritual people of God. And they would, as I say, draw very clear distinctions between the two, even saying that at the end of the 1,000-year reign, when there is judgment and eternity, that Israel will then live on the new earth, and Christians will live in the new heavens, and all sorts of other things that you think, well, where's that in the Bible? But that's basically dispensationalism. They would draw very clear lines between, they would separate out Israel and the church. And the church is seen very much as a parenthesis. God was working with Israel, didn't quite work out. Let's try the Gentiles. That didn't work out. Let's come back to Israel. And therefore, now we should be working towards that golden age. We should be working towards bringing about the return of Christ, the fulfillment of promises and prophecies, Israel being in the land, Israel being in Jerusalem, all those kind of things. So that's, in a nutshell, dispensational Zionism. Obviously very pro-Israel.
That's very helpful.
Even to the point where you get there was one very leading Zionist in America who spoke to a group of ambassadors and senators and said, we should start a war with Iran because that would bring about the Battle of Armageddon and hasten the return of Christ. And you just think, no,
wow,
what on earth are you?
Yeah, you see how it impacts politics as well. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And you see in your answer there as well that it is informed as well by how you understand and make sense of the book of Revelation. That plays a big part of it. And you can also see how it shapes your view of the church. And that's quite interesting when it comes to, our job as pastors. What are we doing, and how central and significant is the church, the ingathering of the Gentiles into the spiritual people of God? So that's really helpful, really fascinating. We've got loads of questions on that, which we'll come back to it before we kind of critique all three viewpoints. But you're right in saying that there's a militancy and an importance to it as well. We had someone who was warned not to join us unless we were dispensational Zionists or Zionists. I don't know which one, whether they differentiate. And so you think for some people, it's a very, very important issue for all of the reasons that you said so far. Okay, well, that's dispensational Zionism. Talk to us about classical Zionism, how it is similar and different.
Generally less militant. So it would have a much more positive view of the church. So classical Zionism, and I suspect many of the people, not all, but many of the people who come to our churches would probably be more in this camp. And I suspect there are many within New Frontiers who would probably sit, if not in this camp, somewhere between, in a fuzzy area between kind of this and fulfillment theology, I suspect. So classical Zionism, as I say, much less militant and would have a much more positive view of the church. The church is the spiritual fulfillment of Old Testament promises and prophecies, and they would see the church as a glorious body of Christ made from Jews and Gentiles coming together. So they would have generally a very positive view of the church, but they would still distinguish between they would say, yes, the church is the covenant people of God fulfilling many Old Testament promises. But they would also see Israel, ethnic Israel, as also the covenant people of God on earth, still going to inherit the promises and see them fulfilled in a physical way. So again, this kind of physical, spiritual distinction, they would see much less separation between Israel and the church, because they would see much more continuity, which I would certainly agree with. But they would also say, yes, there's continuity from Old Testament into New Testament church, but there's also continuity. Israel itself carries on as the covenant people of God. And so the establishing of the state of Israel is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies and promises. And so Yeah, they would still be premillennial, but they would see, rather than Jesus reigning with ethnic Jews from Jerusalem, they would usually see Jesus reigning from Jerusalem with Christians, with believing Jews and Gentiles. It's certainly not as militant, much more positive about the church, but still has these two people of God.
Would they still hold to the dispensational idea of history?
No, they wouldn't divide history up in that. I mean, they might broadly. I think as you look back through history, you can see God working in different ways at different times, but they wouldn't divide it up in such a rigid system.
Okay. Where does the idea of a spiritual and physical people come from? Even that separation of physical, spiritual doesn't necessarily seem to be part of the biblical worldview. Where does the idea come from for them?
I don't know is the short answer. I think this distinction between the two is that I obviously will talk about fulfillment theology in a minute, but I think the Old Testament promises and prophecies are fulfilled in physical people on a physical earth. So they're trying to differentiate between two people of God. So they're saying there is the church, and that is the fulfillment of the prophecies. But because they want to hold on to Israel, they've got to find some way of distinguishing between the two. So quite how they get there with the physical and the spiritual, someone like David Pawson would be a classical Zionist, and some of his language, there does seem to be quite a lot of overlap, I would say, Israel and the church, and quite what's physical, what's spiritual. So quite how they get there, in all honesty, I don't know the answer to that.
And I think you quote Pawson at times in your book, your paper, where he seems to make statements that affirm both a fulfillment concept of one new man, but also want to hold on to this separation concept of, no, there are two peoples of God. So that's interesting to me, which we'll come on to. But let's then talk about the third way of understanding this conversation. Fulfillment theology, or as I've recently learned, sometimes gets kind of slanderously called replacement theology. What is this theology?
So, just to mention replacement theology then, firstly. So replacement theology was the name given to much of the teaching of the church throughout its history, and that was that the church has replaced Israel as the people of God. And so many of the church fathers, as I say, they would say throughout the Old Testament, it's a Christian book, it's talking about Jesus and the church, and lots of the images and things point to the church. Some of what, of course, I would agree with, but I think the word replacement, I wouldn't use it firstly because it's so loaded today with a lot of baggage and anti-Semitism and those kind of things. And actually, a number of churches have come out very strongly to say we disagree with replacement theology. So the Anglican Church did it 30, 40 years ago, made a very strong statement. So I wouldn't use it because it's got baggage, but I don't think it's the most biblical word anyway, because if you look at the language of the New Testament, it isn't that the church has replaced Israel. And a lot of people, when they talk about the church replacing Israel, some of the language that they use is quite woolly. So there was a guy called, what's his name? Ronald DeProse, who's written a number of books on replacement theology. I think one of them was for his PhD some years ago. I'm not saying he endorses this theology. I think he's just written about it. But sometimes they talk about the church replacing Israel, and sometimes they talk about Gentiles replacing Jews. And those are very different things. And so the language of replacement, I think, is a very unhelpful word, because if you look at something like Romans 11, to give an example, then the illustration that Paul uses there is that Israel is the root, the natural olive root, and Gentiles are wild olive branches grafted in. We are grafted into their roots. We join their faith, if you like, and we worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when we sing, it's funny sometimes when we sing songs like "I will serve no foreign god," it was a song a few years ago. He said, "I will serve no foreign god," and I'm like, well, that's not entirely true, because in one sense we do, and I think the danger is that we reject or ignore or overlook or forget our Jewish roots, if you like. Jesus was a Jew. The history began with Israel and the faith of Israel. So the language of replacement, I think, is very unhelpful. And that's where I think the language of fulfillment is a much better word, because throughout the New Testament, Jesus fulfills, the prophets often, we celebrate it at Christmas. The prophets say, this happened, the gospel writers say, this happened in order to fulfill the prophets. And patterns and types in the Old Testament are clearly fulfilled in Jesus and in the church. And so patterns, obviously, of temple and priest and priesthood and sacrifice and being the children of God and being the children of Abraham and all of those things, the New Testament says this is fulfillment. We fulfill those. You get Peter saying, you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Words like replacement, I think, are very unhelpful, because they in a similar but different way to dispensationalism, they disconnect Israel from the church, when actually I don't think that's the language of the New Testament. The language of the New Testament is fulfillment, and more than fulfillment, I think the language of the New Testament is development and expansion. So what I see in the New Testament particularly is how, and this goes back to my point about being physical, that the promises made to Abraham, the promise made in Genesis 15 was, I'll make your name great. And then again repeated in 17 and in later chapters. As many descendants as the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. So a promise about many descendants, and also a promise of land. And what you see then is the promise even to Abraham, all nations on earth will be blessed through you. So you see this development then, I think, throughout the Bible of fulfillment, of expansion. And I think words like expansion and fulfillment, to me, seem much more biblical than replacement. So with the people of God, God began with one man. It became a family. It became a nation. But one day, it'll be people from every tribe and every nation. Then you have Old Testament begins in a garden. Then you have a piece of land, a land in the Middle East. But the promises of the New Testament are of a renewed earth, and that the meek shall inherit the earth. So I think the language for me is of fulfillment and expansion. These two promises of people and land are fulfilled in the people of God, the church, from every tribe and nation, living on a renewed earth. That feels for me much more biblical, and I think that fits with more of the New Testament language and patterns and teaching.
That's very helpful. And actually, as an overview of the 3 points of view, I think that's very, very useful and informative and instructive for us if you've not thought about this before. Actually, some of the key texts, perhaps in the fulfillment case, things like Romans 2 that says, no one is a Jew outwardly, but one inwardly. Circumcision is not one outward, but of the heart. It's interesting, as you were talking as well, I was just thinking about what it is that makes the land something that's attached to a people. I was talking to Matt Hosier, who just made reference to the fact that the word nation is ethnos, that actually it's a people group. And the land is significant because, I guess, in the Old Testament, the land is the place where that particular ethnos worships its particular god. That's what the nations had. They had their god and they had the territory associated with that god. And what you see in Yahweh's case is that he is forever overstepping the boundaries and entering the territory of other gods, because Yahweh knows no boundaries and actually Yahweh owns the entire earth. And so even to that, you think, well, the people of God are now an international, a multi-ethnos people, and therefore the land associated with the God of these people is all over the place. But I do think the land is one of the key things that people come back to, because they say, well, God promised Abraham this particular strip in the Middle East. What do you do with those promises? And often the charges are you claiming that God breaks his promises then to this people? Do you want to just kind of speak into that question about the land, which is quite a hotly debated
Yes,
subject?
I mean, firstly, it's hard to be very clear about exactly the boundary of the land, because different promises actually do put it slightly differently. What you do have to recognize, though, is that the current nation of Israel doesn't actually fulfill any of those promises at the moment. So although you say, okay, they've come back to Jerusalem, they're occupying a piece of land, they don't occupy the land all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates, which was one of the early promises. So I think, and what you do see then, of course, is that when you say Israel has a divine right to the land, which land? And that, again, very quickly, a theological statement becomes very politically loaded, because if you say Israel has a divine right to the land, then what you are saying is Israel has a divine right to occupy not just where it is now, but parts of Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And so I think which land is an interesting question. But I think the Old Testament promises of land, I find it's very easy to latch onto a promise to Abraham as if it's an unconditional promise, because it looks like at the beginning it is an unconditional promise. God says, I'll give you this piece of land. But of course, when they come to enter the land, it very quickly becomes evident that God expects faith and obedience in order to enter the land. And so I would distinguish between the promise and possession of the land. So the promise appears to be unconditional. But of course, when they get to the land, God says, where's faith and obedience? Are you going to trust me? Are you going to walk with me? And all of them, apart from Joshua and Caleb, didn't trust God. And so God said, you can't enter the land then. So God clearly expects faith and obedience in order to enter the land and possess the land. And then God expects faith and obedience in order to stay in the land. Because again and again, God says through the prophets, if you don't return to me, then you will be exiled out of the land. And in passages like, I think it's in Leviticus 18, where God says, keep my commandments, and if you don't, then the land will vomit you out just as it vomited out the previous inhabitants. And so I think the promise looks unconditional, but when you come to it, clearly God expects faith and obedience. God says, this is my land. So it's not simply, I've given it to Israel and I can't do anything about that. No, it's God's land, and you can only have possession of the land if you walk with God. And that's one of the difficulties I would question today, is if you're saying, not you, if one is saying that Israel has a divine right to be in the land, then surely what you are saying is Israel is walking in faith and obedience to God, because that's the only basis on which you can claim the land. Forgetting the Old New Testament stuff for a moment, but if you're just simply going to look at Old Testament promises, I think, without again being political, I think you've got to question, is the current nation of Israel walking in faith and obedience to God? I don't see that. So I think the promise of land is looks unconditional. Clearly, God expects faith and obedience in terms of inheriting the land and possessing the land, even of Israel. And then when you come to later prophecies and promises, what you see is there's never just a promise of land on its own. I will bring you back to this land. But for example, Zionists are very quick to quote from Jeremiah 32, I will gather you from the ends of the earth and I'll bring you back into the land. But Jeremiah continues in the next chapter to say, and I will put a king on the throne in Jerusalem, the temple will be rebuilt, the Levites will be restored, and sacrifices will be offered. So if you're going to say that, then this prophecy is fulfilled, you can't just arbitrarily take out the promise of land and say, oh, this is fulfilled, without saying, I am also expecting all of these others to be fulfilled, which of course you don't see. So I think I do find that people very easily take some promises and not others. They take a promise given to Abraham, but they ignore the promise of being vomited out of the land. They take the promise of land, but ignore the promises of temple and king and those things, which, where's that? I think that's from an Old Testament point of view. And then, as I say, there's all sorts of New Testament.
Very helpful.
passages as well.
Yeah, and we'll come on to some of those New Testament passages as well. Really, really helpful, Adrian. I appreciate how much you've thought about this and kind of making this clear to people who haven't thought about this before. Because I think it's something that for many people, again, on a very kind of superficial level, on one sense, you see, maybe not superficial, but you see the word Israel in the Old Testament. And then you see the word Israel on our current maps and you think, well, they're the same thing. That's the same thing. So therefore, of course, this is what this is all talking about. Your answer ended with, and that's just considering some of the passages in the Old Testament. And then when you come to the New, which you've alluded to already, I suppose, with reference to the meek shall inherit the earth rather than the land. But how does the New Testament make sense of God's promise to Abraham and the land?
So firstly, reference in terms of the meek shall inherit the earth is from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. The words used there, it could be land. It could be the meek shall inherit the land. That, I think, is no translation does that because the audience there, Matthew makes clear, is from different nations. And so it wouldn't make sense. It's not talking about the Jewish meek. It is talking about, obviously, the Sermon on the Mount applies to all people. So Jesus is saying, I think, the meek or the humble shall inherit the earth. And I think that's the new earth. Jesus doesn't make much reference, to be fair, to the land. He obviously went to the people of Israel, but then he sends his disciples out and into the world. Interestingly, what you do find at the end of the Gospels and the beginning of Acts, Jesus then teaches his disciples for 40 days on the kingdom of God. Now, we don't know exactly what he said. Obviously, we have some of his earlier teaching on the kingdom of God. He teaches them for 40 days. Then he says, right, you will receive the Spirit. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Then the Spirit comes upon them. And then what you see in early Acts is some of these believers then who have houses and land in Jerusalem, they sell them and they lay their proceeds from that at the feet of the apostles. Now, I think that is a fascinating thing to happen, because if Israel and if Jerusalem, if this is the future, if Israel and the Promised Land are the future, if this is God's future plan for the world, then why do these early Christians sell their houses and houses and land and give the money to the cause of global mission? It seems to me sometimes that Zionists are more concerned with the land than the early church were. So they were selling, as I say, land and houses, giving it to the cause of global mission. Then if you get into the teaching of the apostles, it absolutely fascinating in that Romans 4:13, Paul changes the promise to Abraham. Very interesting. He says that the promise to Abraham and his descendants was that he would inherit the world. And the word used there actually is the word cosmos. And now that's really interesting. Why didn't he use the word land? But he says, no, the promise was that he would inherit the whole world. If you then go on to Hebrews 11, I think Hebrews 11 for me is an absolutely key passage. So Hebrews 11 here, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Now, that's a fascinating thing to do, because surely the promise was of being in the land of promise. That's where to make your home. That's where to put down roots. This is the goal. This is what you've been aiming for. And yet it says, no, that's not true. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And then, jumping on a few verses to verse 13, all these peoples, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joseph, whatever, all of the patriarchs and so on, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, they'd have opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And then jumping right down to the end of Hebrews 11, all of these were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Now, that for me is such a clear passage that actually Abraham arrives in the promised land. You would think that's it. He's arrived. He's got there. This is it. This is the fulfillment of the promise. But no, because it's as if he's saying, "I've got here, but it's not really about this land because I'm looking forward to a better country." And even this, again, they arrive. They haven't received the fulfillment of the promise. Well, but when Joshua arrives in the land and he just takes the cities, and right through then that era of Joshua and the kings and so, they surely occupied the land. And yet it says here in Hebrews 11, they didn't receive what was promised. Why not? Because only together with us are they made complete, because they're looking forward to a greater, a heavenly land. And so for me, this is where all those Old Testament promises and prophecies are fulfilled in the church, in Jesus and in the church. And as I say, when people say things like, oh, you've dismissed the promises, or God's gone back on his word, or that's not true at all. The promise was for a piece of land in the Middle East. Abraham will inherit the whole earth. So he's not going to be disappointed. He's not going to say, oh no, I was expecting just a piece of land in the Middle East. He inherits the whole earth. So we're not spiritualizing away the promises. We're saying the promises are fulfilled in real people on a real earth, but they are the people of God, the church, inhabiting the renewed earth. And so for me, that is
Super.
how I understand the promises in the Old Testament fulfilled in the New. Hebrews 11, as I say, is a clincher for me.
That's superb. Thank you. I really appreciate the reading of that and explaining that. I think one of the observations I have of dispensational classical Zionism is their overemphasis, or their emphasis on Old Testament texts, at the disregard sometimes of thinking about how the New Testament makes sense of those Old Testament promises. Is that something that you've come across as well? That actually there doesn't seem to be much awareness that in the coming of Christ, the game has changed significantly. Something's happened to really alter how we should read and make sense of the Old Testament.
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with Zionism is that it seems like the coming of Jesus hasn't made any difference to the Old Testament, hasn't made any difference to how you read it. And so the coming of Jesus and then the teaching of the apostles, they aren't reading the Old Testament through the lens. It's as if classical Zionists probably more so, in that they would say, yes, so again, going back to the classical Zionists who have still two people of God, from a church point of view, yes, they read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. But then we have another people of God, and they just go straight to the Old Testament. Well, surely what makes us Christian is we read the Bible through the lens of the New Testament. You do see people quite a bit today. Let's explore how did the Jews understand the Old Testament? How did they read their Old Testament? And I'm not saying that's unimportant or unhelpful. It could be very helpful. But in the end, the key is not how do Jews read their Old Testament. The key for us is how did the apostles how did Jesus read the Old Testament? How did the apostles, what did they say? Because that is the lens that makes our faith Christian. And as you say, I think that doesn't seem to be the case with Zionism, definitely with dispensational Zionism, but it's still true even then of classical Zionists. What difference has Jesus made to the Old Testament promises? I don't see that being answered.
Yeah, superb. Thank you. Well, kind of next or related question in my mind has to do with the ethnicity of the people of God and the Jewishness of Jewish people. Does that count for anything anymore? Is it of any significance? And how should we think about how should we think about that in light of, say, the letter to the Galatians, which seems to go to great lengths to answer that question? So I'd just love to get your thoughts on that. What of the Jewish people? What part should we think that they have by virtue of their
So,
ethnicity?
obviously in books like Galatians and early Romans as well, the gospel is presented as both Jew and Gentile. The only way of salvation is through faith in Christ. There is no other way, and you cannot become righteous by observing the law. And so, in that sense, what advantage is there of being a Jew? Well, obviously, in one sense, Paul goes through some of these questions. There is the advantage in that, yes, you've had the promises, you've had the scriptures, and all these point to the Messiah. So, there, in terms of faith in Jesus, and that's the context of verses like Galatians 3:29, where it talks about there is no Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male and female. That verse is often used and abused, referring to things like gender roles and things like that. It's not talking about gender roles. It is saying that all the different divisions that we place on people, they are irrelevant when it comes to being united in Christ. We are all one in Christ. It's not saying we're all equal. It's not talking about gender equality. It is saying we are all united in Christ by our faith in Him, and so at one level, if you like, you could say there is no advantage in being a Jew. We're all sinners. We all come to salvation by faith in Christ, and that's the only way, faith alone. But then when you get to Romans 9-11, Paul asks this question, so has God finished with the Jews? Has God totally rejected the Jews? And his answer is no. And he gives two reasons for that. He says, firstly, God has not finished with the Jews because there is still a remnant, and he says, I myself am a Jew. So God has not totally rejected Israel. And that's why we need to be, again, really careful that we don't think of the church as Gentile. Oh, Old Testament Israel, New Testament church Gentile. But no, the New Testament church is from every tribe and every nation, including the Jews. There is a remnant. Yes. But so Paul says, it's evident now that God has not rejected Israel because I'm here. So firstly, there's a remnant. But then he says, but God still has a future plan to bring in a great harvest of Jews. Now, what exactly that means, and obviously different views on when Paul says all Israel will be saved. But nevertheless, I would say we can look forward to a large number of Jewish people coming to faith in Christ. And so in that sense, I think God has not finished with ethnic Israel. I believe that there will be a harvest. And so having said, the dispensationalists say, no, everything we do should be working towards, supporting Israel and so on. The danger, I think, is that we overreact to Zionism, and particularly dispensational Zionism. We overreact and back off from mission to Israel. I don't want to be seen as pro-Israel. Well, no. In one sense, I am pro-Israel because I want Jews to be saved, as I want people from every tribe and nation to be saved. And there's a promise of Jews being saved in the way that perhaps there isn't a promise for any other nation. Now, I do believe people from every tribe and nation will come, but I do believe God is going to do a great work in Israel at some point in the future. So in terms of faith and salvation, is there an advantage of being an ethnic Jew? No, we're all sinners. The only way to gain righteousness is through faith in Christ. But I do believe that there will be a harvest among the Jews, and a large number, whether it's a majority but a large number, will be saved.
That's superb. I really appreciate this. I've really tried to put you through some of your paces into kind of pulling out verses from here, there, and everywhere. It's something you've obviously thought a lot about and taught on. And just on that, in light of the challenges related to talking about this subject, and in light of the strong views that people hold on this subject, and in light of the events in the Middle East in recent years, what what practically, is there anything that you've done practically as a pastor in your local church to help people understand current events or to speak into them so that people don't end up being, pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian in this conflict? Because there's a danger for that as well. But instead, we want to be pro-people of God in Palestine and in Israel, shall we say? And how have you taught people to pray about this, and tried to navigate some of this? Either things you've done or you recommend to pastors do?
I think, well, firstly, I think it is really important that we do speak into these things and not avoid them. As I said earlier, I think the danger is, because of some of the history, the danger is we think, oh, I don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism, so I'll avoid it altogether. And that probably is unhelpful. I think my general approach in terms of politics is to try and avoid being political. I think I find some pastors, in my view, perhaps too political, and in the sense of party political, and I'm not sure that's helpful. I don't mind being political, as in I would be quite happy challenging one party on this and another party on that. So I'm not saying don't be political at all. I'm just saying it's party politics I would avoid. But I think on a subject like Israel, I think you've got to teach into it. And so what we did very early on in the conflict, almost as soon as it kicked off, I said, we're going to pause, our Sunday preaching series, and we're going to teach into this. And I guess for me, having researched it a bit, I was perhaps a bit more kind of prepared for that. But I think it's really important that people understand something of the history and something of the theological issues. And again, something of the history helps people appreciate the complexity of it. And so it is, when we're pro-Zionist, that makes it very difficult for Arabic Christians. And if you're a Palestinian Christian, how does that fit if the Christian world is seen as pro-Zion? It makes it very difficult for you to be a Christian, and it makes it very difficult for us to evangelize Arabic nations, because then it's as if they're not just converting to follow Christ, they're converting to being Zionist, and I think that's very unhelpful. So I would say we taught on it. I produced, as I say, a little booklet on it, which came out of my paper, and I wrote a few different little booklets that we have out on a Sunday that are just for people to read. This might be my cowardice, but I thought if I put some booklets out stating our position, then it kind of heads some things off ahead of time. And so we would have a booklet on Israel in the church. I've got some booklets about being complementarian, Christians and politics, some apologetics things as well. So that if someone comes to the church and if they're pro-Israel, then I'm happy to have a conversation. Of course I am, but I think I want them ahead of time, if you like. They come to the church, if they spot that, then they'll think, okay, maybe this isn't the church for me. And maybe it isn't.
Yeah.
Because what can easily happen is people can come along, they connect with the church for a few months, they make friends, and then there are tensions over one of these kind of issues, and that can affect quite a lot of people. And I've seen that in multiple churches on this issue and others. So I would tend to head off some of those things early. And I think we've prayed about the situation and for peace in Israel and this situation. I mean, it's hard because I think neither side in this kind of thing is without fault. I think you look at some of the things that people put online and some of the pro-Palestinian stuff. I think some of the stuff that Israel has done, as I say, seems a huge overreaction, and yet you've got to remember their history. But then you look at the things the Palestinians have done and what Palestinian life is like under Hamas and under Islamic rule, and it's like, would you want to be in those countries? So it's complicated. I think we would want people to just be cautious. I think of being, people can be so black and white and so polarized, and it's this, and I'm like, the Middle East, that you can't. It is very hard to be very black and white about the Middle East because it's so complicated.
That's very helpful. And I know when we spoke about this before, I was really encouraged by your idea, actually, of putting some of those things out early doors to people who visit your church, because I've certainly fallen foul of that. You know, people get into the church, they kind of fall in love with the church and its community, and then discover that they have a really big issue with you. That's something, you know, you just haven't spoken about it because, you know, on this issue, you think, I haven't spoken about it because I doesn't really come up lots. You know, I believe in the people of God. Yeah. And it's interesting also as well, the distraction, the tendency to distraction that perhaps Zionism can cause. I know in the early years of a church plant, we had a couple join us who are very Zionist in their persuasion. And I could sense there was going to be a distraction for us as a church plant, because they want us to pray for Israel and try to get involved in mission to Israel, which is, of course, in one sense, completely fine. But I remember saying to them, like, do you know any Jewish people who live in this town? Have you met any? And they didn't. And I thought, well, we're here in this town to try to reach this town, because there's thousands of people here who don't know the gospel. And if churches get caught up in this, we've got to go save this ethnic group in that part of the world, or help them get back to their part of the world, which is another kind of cause of Zionists. You think, that's just going to distract us from what we're called to do. But if you think through and understand, as you've helpfully pointed out, the lower view of the church than perhaps I would share, I can understand why they might do that. I also think as well in this conversation, language is key, and challenging and not accepting people's premises or language that they slip into there. You've critiqued rightly the concept of replacement theology, but even just then you said people come to the church and they might be pro-Israel. Now I know what you mean in light of what we talked about. I had someone phone me this week and say, are you pro-Israel or are you anti-Israel? And I said, I'm pro-Israel because I'm pro the nations of God coming to the Messiah. So I'm not going to swallow this language of, I'm pro-Israel above, and I preference them above all the other nations of the world, because I just don't see that in the New Covenant. So there's lots in so much of what you said. Any reflections on that as we start to draw the conversation into a close? There's been so much here that's been really helpful.
Good. I think, as you say, language is so important. And I think it is often what you mean by it. If someone came to us saying, I'm pro-France, you wouldn't, I'm pro-France. I love France, So I think it is seeing what's beneath that. And I think that's why things like putting out the booklets, I think it draws those things to the surface more quickly, for me anyway, so that people coming along, they explain, if they wouldn't just say, are you pro-Israel or not? And as you say, it's so polarized, it's so black and white. And so, I would be cautious with my language in terms of preaching and things like that, and how I spoke about Israel, and how I think, yes, you do have to be very careful what you say, especially now, of course, with things going online and all that kind of stuff. So I think I would be very careful what I said. And I think we've had people come and they've just with all integrity and they've read books, and some of the books are well written. Some of the books are awful, but some of them are well written books by good people, and so I think we just need to be careful that we aren't. Well, I want to be passionate and I want to be clear, but I don't want to be militant. The danger is with lots of things, we always swing the other way and overreact and become just as militant. And actually, as I say, if someone came along saying, I'd like to pray for Israel, then okay, well, let's talk about that. What does that mean? Do you feel a call to go there? Do you feel a call to plant a church? What do you feel? Or are you wanting us as a church to be Zionist? Where are you on this spectrum, if you like? So I think it is not just taking a label at face value, because they all mean different things to different people, but teasing it out a bit. Oh, come on, what do we mean by? What do you mean by that? Well, this is what I mean by that. I think, as you say, those things on lots of subjects, not just on this subject.
Yeah, there's a phrase I heard recently: clarity is kindness, and I think that's really helpful in a lot of these things up front. It's something I'm trying to learn from mistakes I've made in the past. Clarity is kindness. Really, really good. Well, Adrian, as we come in to kind of finish, You may have kind of left us with your parting comments and shot there already, which I think is really helpful about language. But is there anything particularly related to this subject on your heart or on your mind that you'd really like to kind of finish with?
There's just one more thing I think it's worth pointing out. In Romans 11, one of the things Paul says is that the church should provoke Israel to jealousy. And I just think, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see our churches so full of the presence of God and the joy of God and the power of, I'd love to see people being healed and so set free. I think there's a challenge in Romans 11 that actually, what are our churches like? That does your church, does your life provoke Jewish people to jealousy, that they want something of what you have? And I think if there's anything that the church should be doing, it should be demonstrating the kingdom of God and the presence and power of God and the joy of God and the peace of God, that actually we are so exhibiting these things that we provoke Israel and the Jewish people to jealousy. And I think that's a challenge for us at a personal level and, of course, at a church level as well. So that would be my closing kind of
thank you. And
for all of us, really.
yeah, superb. Thank you. And if it's okay with you, I'll put your email in the show notes. And if people want the booklet that you've written, could they email you and get that?
Yes, it's in the process of being rewritten, but I'm very happy for people to email me, and yes, I'm just in the process of expanding it a little bit out. So, but yeah, give my email and they can get in touch. Fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Adrian. It's been a joy talking to you.